Daniel Ghost Morrison thought he was just checking on his 7-year-old son's progress at school. But when he reached the classroom window, he heard a voice that made his blood freeze. Through the glass, he saw little Jake trembling, his small hands shaking as his teacher stood over him. Her words, sharp as knives, destroyed him in front of 20 witnesses. This wasn't teaching. This was torture. And when Daniel stepped through that doorway, the expression on his face changed the room instantly. Within hours, 250 Iron Riders would surround that school. What happened next would transform an entire community. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. Daniel Morrison wasn't the kind of man who rattled easily. Standing 6 feet 4 inches with a presence that made people step aside and arms marked with ink that told stories of loyalty and brotherhood, he'd earned his road name Ghost because he moved through difficult situations with almost supernatural calm. The brothers in his Iron Riders motorcycle club called him that because when Daniel decided something needed to happen, it happened, quietly, methodically, without unnecessary drama. But there was one thing in this world that could shake Ghost to his core: seeing his son suffer. Jake was 7 years old. Just 7. He had his father's dark hair and a curiosity about the world that used to fill their small house with questions and laughter. Used to. That was the part that kept Daniel awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering what he was missing. For months ago, Jake would bound into the morning excited about school, talking about science experiments and books they were reading, about the fort he and his friends were building at recess. He'd help Daniel make breakfast, telling elaborate stories about dinosaurs and space exploration while they scrambled eggs together. Those mornings felt golden, proof that despite raising Jake alone after his wife died when Jake was 3, he was doing something right. But somewhere along the way, everything changed. It started small. Jake would move slower in the mornings, his eyes staying on the floor. The questions stopped. The laughter became rare. When Daniel asked about school, Jake would give one-word answers. Fine. Okay. Nothing. His backpack would hit the floor with a heaviness that seemed wrong for such a small person, and he'd retreat to his room, closing the door softly behind him. Daniel tried everything. He'd sit with Jake at bedtime, reading his favorite books, asking gentle questions. Was someone being mean? Did he feel sick? Was the work too hard? Jake would just shake his head, his small fingers twisting the edge of his blanket, and whisper that everything was fine. But his body told a different story. The way his shoulders hunched, the way he flinched at sudden noises, the way he apologized for things that weren't his fault. This morning had been the worst yet. Daniel had woken Jake gently, like he always did, rubbing his back and telling him it was time to get ready. Jake's eyes had opened, and for just a moment, Daniel saw something that made his chest tighten. Dread. Pure, unmistakable dread. Jake didn't argue, didn't complain. He just climbed out of bed with the resignation of someone heading to a place they desperately didn't want to go. At breakfast, he barely touched the cereal. Daniel sat across from him at their small kitchen table, watching him push Cheerios around the bowl, and felt that familiar knot of helplessness tightening in his gut. He was a man who fixed problems. If his bike broke down, he tore it apart until he understood what was wrong. If a brother in the club needed help, Daniel showed up with tools and muscle and whatever it took. But this, his own son suffering right in front of him, and he couldn't figure out how to help. He reached across the table and put his large, callous hand over Jake's small one. Jake, buddy, talk to me. Please. What's going on? Jake looked up at him with those big, sad eyes, and Daniel could see him trying to find words. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Then he just shook his head and whispered, I don't know, Dad. I don't feel good about school. Daniel's mind raced. He'd talked to Jake's teacher at the last parent conference 3 months ago, Mrs. Richardson, a woman in her late 40s with a tight smile and a way of speaking that felt just a little too controlled. She'd told him Jake was doing fine academically but was withdrawn, didn't participate much, seemed distracted. Daniel had mentioned Jake's change in behavior at home, and Mrs. Richardson had waved it off. Probably just an adjustment phase. Some children take longer to settle into the school routine. Give it time. But it had been months, and Jake wasn't settling in. He was shutting down. Daniel drove him to school that morning in his pickup truck, the one vehicle he owned that didn't require a helmet. Jake sat in the passenger seat, his backpack clutched in his lap like a shield, staring out the window at the gray November sky. Daniel pulled up to the drop-off line and watched as other kids bounce out of their cars, excited to see friends, running toward the building with energy and life. Jake unbuckled his seatbelt slowly. Daniel caught his hand before he could reach for the door handle. "Hey," he said softly, "you know I love you more than anything in this world, right?" Jake nodded but wouldn't meet his eyes. "And you know if something's wrong, if anyone is hurting you or scaring you, you can tell me. I'll fix it. I promise." Jake finally looked at him, and there was something in his expression that broke Daniel's heart, a kind of hopeless acceptance, like he wanted to believe him but didn't think he could help. He leaned over and hugged Daniel tight, and Daniel held his little boy, feeling his small body press against his chest, and made a decision right then and there. Something was wrong. He didn't have proof. He didn't have details. But every instinct he'd honed over 45 years of life was screaming at him that his son was not okay. And if Jake couldn't tell him what was happening, then he needed to see for himself. After Jake disappeared through the school doors, Daniel sat in his truck for a long moment, engine idling, mind working. He pulled out his phone and texted his shop foreman. Need to take a personal day. Family stuff. Then he drove home, changed into a clean shirt without the club logo, and decided he'd give Jake a few hours to settle in. Then he'd drive back to school. He'd bring Jake's favorite snack, those peanut butter cookies from the bakery he loved, and surprise him, maybe take him out for lunch. But more than that, he'd pay attention. He'd watch. He'd see what was really going on in that building where his son spent 7 hours a day looking more and more like a trapped animal. Daniel had no idea that a surprise visit would uncover something that had been hidden in plain sight for months. He had no idea that within hours he'd be making a phone call that would change everything. And he had no idea that before the sun set on this ordinary Wednesday, 250 of his brothers would be standing in that school parking lot, engine silent, arms crossed, refusing to leave until someone answered for what they'd done to the children in their care. All he knew, sitting in his living room that afternoon, lacing up his boots and pocketing those cookies, was that he was done waiting for Jake to find the words. He was done trusting that the adults in that building had his son's best interests at heart. He was going to find out the truth. And whatever he discovered, whatever was stealing the light from his little boy's eyes, he would handle it the only way he knew how. By showing up, by being present, by refusing to look away. Because that's what fathers do. The front office of Pinewood Elementary smelled like fresh paper and lemon cleaner. Daniel pushed through the glass doors at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a white bakery box balance in one hand, and offered the receptionist behind the counter his most disarming smile. The woman, whose nameplate read Mrs. Palmer, looked up from her computer and did a double take at the sight of him. All 6 feet 4 inches, leather jacket, and road-worn presence. But Daniel had learned long ago how to put people at ease when he needed to. "Afternoon," he said warmly. "I'm Daniel Morrison, Jake's dad. Just wanted to surprise him with a little treat. Thought I'd drop these cookies off and maybe say hi if he's got a minute." Mrs. Palmer's expression softened immediately. "Oh, how sweet. Jake's in Mrs. Richardson's class, room 104, down that hallway and to the right. I'm sure he'll be thrilled to see you." Daniel thanked her and headed down the corridor, his boots making soft sounds against the polished linoleum. The hallway was exactly what you'd expect in an elementary school. Bright fluorescent lights overhead, bulletin boards covered in construction paper and student artwork, alphabet letters marching along the walls in cheerful primary colors. From one classroom, he could hear children singing a song about the water cycle. From another, the sound of a teacher reading aloud, her voice animated and engaging. It all seemed so normal, so safe. Maybe he'd been overreacting. Maybe Jake really was just going through a phase. He turned right, following the room numbers. 100, 102, 104 was just ahead, the door partially open. Daniel slowed his pace, not wanting to disrupt the class. He'd just look in, catch Jake's eye, maybe motion him out for a quick hug, and hand him the cookies. 2 minutes, and he'd be gone. But then he heard the voice. It cut through the ambient noise of the school like a blade, sharp, cold, and dripping with contempt. Daniel stopped walking. The voice was coming from room 104. A woman's voice. Mrs. Richardson's voice. And the tone made every protective instinct in his body flare to life. Are you really this incapable, or are you just not trying? The words were precise, calculated, designed to cut. Do you see anyone else in this classroom struggling with something this simple? Do you? Daniel moved closer to the doorway, his heart beginning to pound. Through the rectangular window in the door, he could see into the classroom. 20-some children sat at desks arranged in neat rows. At the front of the room, standing at the whiteboard, was Mrs. Richardson, a woman in her late 40s wearing a blazer and slacks, her hair pulled back severely, her posture rigid with authority. And in front of her, small and trembling, stood Jake. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His son's back was partially to him, but he could see everything he needed to see. Jake's shoulders were hunched inward, his head bowed, his hands twisting together at his waist in that nervous gesture Daniel had seen so many times at home. He was trying to make himself smaller, trying to disappear. Mrs. Richardson took a step closer to Jake, leaning down so her face was level with the child's. I asked you a question. Are you incapable or are you lazy? Which one is it? Jake's voice came out barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. I'm trying. I just don't understand. Don't understand? Mrs. Richardson's laugh was harsh and humorless. A kindergartner could do this problem. You're in 2nd grade. What does that tell you about yourself? Daniel's hands clenched into fists. The bakery box crumpled slightly under the pressure. He could feel his pulse in his temples, a roaring building in his ears. But he didn't move yet. He needed to see. He needed to understand the full scope of what was happening. Jake's small voice tried again. I'm sorry. I'll try harder. You're always sorry, Mrs. Richardson snapped. Sorry doesn't fix the fact that you're wasting my time and everyone else's time in this classroom. She gestured broadly at the other students. Do you see how you're holding everyone back? Do you see how your classmates are waiting because you can't do something this basic? Daniel's eyes moved to the other children. Some sat frozen, eyes wide, looking like they wanted to be anywhere else. A girl in the front row stared down at her desk, deliberately not watching. A boy near the window had his hands pressed together, anxious. But what struck Daniel most was that several students looked almost bored, like this was routine, like they'd seen this before, like this was just another Wednesday in Mrs. Richardson's classroom. Jake's voice broke through Daniel's thoughts, smaller than he'd ever heard it. Please, Mrs. Richardson, I'm really trying. I just need... What you need is to pay attention. What you need is to stop making excuses. What you need is to stop being such a... Jake flinched, actually flinched, and in that moment, Daniel saw his son, his brave, sweet, gentle son, look utterly defeated. His shoulders sagged. A tear slipped down his cheek. He whispered one more apology, and the absolute resignation in his voice was the sound of a child who'd been broken down so many times. He no longer believed anyone would help him. Daniel felt something shift in his chest. Every muscle in his body tensed. His jaw clenched so hard he could hear his teeth grind. The leather of his jacket creaked as his shoulders squared. He'd seen men try to intimidate opponents in bar fights. He'd watched bullies operate in every environment imaginable. But this, an adult woman, someone entrusted with the care and education of children, standing over a 7-year-old boy and systematically destroying his spirit with words designed to humiliate and diminish. This was something else. This was cruelty. This was abuse. And it was happening to his son. Mrs. Richardson pointed at Jake's desk. Sit down. We'll try again tomorrow. Though I'm sure you'll waste everyone's time then. 2. Maybe if you cared half as much about learning as you do about. The teacher's words died mid-sentence, because in that instant, she looked up and saw Daniel standing in the doorway. The moment Daniel appeared in that doorway, Mrs. Richardson's entire demeanor changed. But it was already too late. He'd seen everything. He'd heard everything. And the look on his face, controlled, cold, and absolutely terrifying in its stillness, told her she'd made a catastrophic mistake. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, filling the doorway, his eyes locked on the woman who'd been tearing his son apart. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. 20 children held their breath. Mrs. Richardson straightened, her professional mask sliding into place, but her hands betrayed her. They trembled slightly as she smoothed her blazer. Jake turned and saw his father. Relief flooded his face, followed immediately by confusion and something that looked like fear. Not of him, but of what would happen now. His eyes filled with fresh tears. And Daniel, looking at his little boy's face, made a decision. He stepped fully into the classroom, moved past the rows of silent children, and walked directly to Jake. He didn't look at Mrs. Richardson, didn't acknowledge her existence. He simply knelt down, put his large hands gently on his son's shoulders, and spoke in a voice that was calm, steady, and carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Get your backpack, buddy. We're leaving." Jake moved immediately, scrambling to his desk to grab his backpack with the kind of urgency that told Daniel this wasn't the first time he'd wanted to escape this room. Daniel waited, still kneeling, one hand resting gently on Jake's back. He didn't say another word. Didn't need to. His presence alone had changed the entire atmosphere of the classroom. Mrs. Richardson found her voice, though it came out higher than before, strained with false authority. "Mr. Morrison, you can't just... This is highly inappropriate. We're in the middle of a lesson. If you have concerns, you need to schedule a conference through the proper channels." Daniel stood slowly, his full height seeming to fill the room. He still didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on Jake, who had his backpack on now and was looking up at him with hope mixed with fear. He reached down and took Jake's small hand in his large one, and only then did he turn his gaze to Mrs. Richardson. He didn't yell, didn't raise his voice, didn't make threats. He simply looked at her with eyes that had seen hard things in life, eyes that could read people down to their core. And in that look was a complete and total understanding of exactly who she was and what she'd been doing. The silence lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Mrs. Richardson's face went pale. Her mouth opened, then closed. And Daniel saw something flicker across her expression that confirmed everything he needed to know. Guilt. She knew she'd been caught. Daniel turned without a word and walked Jake toward the door, his hand still holding his son's. Behind them, Mrs. Richardson's voice rose, defensive now, talking faster. "I was correcting his behavior. This is taken completely out of context. You don't understand the full situation. These children need structure and discipline." Daniel kept walking. Jake had to take quick steps to keep up with his longer stride, but he didn't complain, didn't ask questions. He just held tight to his father's hand like it was the only solid thing in his world. They moved down the hallway, past the cheerful bulletin boards and the singing classrooms, and Jake looked up at his father with confusion and relief warring on his small face. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he understood one thing with absolute certainty. He was safe now. His dad had come. His dad had seen. And everything was going to be different. Story continues with Daniel confronting the principal, withdrawing Jake, making the call to his Iron Riders brothers, 250 bikers showing up at the school, parents coming forward with similar stories, the investigation revealing systemic abuse, Mrs. Richardson losing her teaching license, district-wide policy changes, Jake healing at a new school, and a community transformed by one father's refusal to accept his child's suffering. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. It helps us share more powerful stories of courage, justice, and communities standing up for what's right. Tell us in the comments, would you have the courage to step in like Daniel did? What does protecting children mean to you? Drop your city below. Let's see how far this message travels. Until next time, stay strong and stand together.